This is Today's Business Leaders. Actionable advice from real-world professionals. And now here's your host, Gabe Arnold.
All right, on today's show, I have Alex Charfen, and he is the founder of many different businesses. I actually first heard you speak, Alex, at ClickFunnels. I think it was San Diego, so I think it was like 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah,
and
that was where Shawn Stevenson spoke.
Exactly, and I got to hear Shawn speak and meet him as well, and such an impactful conference for me.
Yeah.
And I really just realized when you were on the stage that you were different than almost everybody else up there. And it's the first time I started connecting with you and following you. And I just really am grateful for you spending the time here today. So welcome to the show.
Thanks, Gabe. I really appreciate that, man.
Yeah, absolutely. So I always ask all my guests, because I really think it connects with like our story and who we are as entrepreneurs. When did you first realize that you were an entrepreneur?
So I'll let everybody in on the secret. Gabe mentioned he was going to ask me this before, and I didn't know I was an entrepreneur, but I knew I didn't belong in most situations really young. I knew that I was different from the world around me very, very young. I think we call it the 3 awakenings of the entrepreneurial personality type. You knew you were different. You knew you had this innate motivation, like you couldn't turn it off. And then the last one is you start hearing the call of contribution. And when I go out and speak, I'll often ask, like, when did you first know you were different? I get all kinds of answers like, 7, 12, 13, 21, 47, 4 weeks ago. And for me, it was when I met people outside of my family for the first time. I've always felt fundamentally different, and that I didn't feel comfortable around other people. And for most of my life, I haven't. I think it's important to share that. I've been a successful entrepreneur, and one of the ongoing things that I've worked on since I was very young is being comfortable around other people, being able to communicate intelligently with other people. And so for me, I don't, when people say, when did you find entrepreneurship? My answer is usually, I don't feel like I found entrepreneurship. I feel like it saved me. That was the only path for me. I had a lot of trouble following other people's rules, other people's frameworks, other people's systems. School was incredibly difficult for me. I was if I had good teachers, I was usually an A student. And by good teacher, if I had a teacher I related to, it was very easy to be an A student. If I had a teacher I didn't relate to, I had a hard time being better than a D student. So I looked really inconsistent, incongruent. I used to get this all the time, like, Alex, if you would just apply yourself here like you did over here. And I'm 47. I still don't really understand what apply yourself is, because if I don't want to do something, I still can't apply myself into doing it. No matter how hard I try, if it's something I just don't want to do, I can set the goal, I can put it down, I can meditate about it in the morning, and then I just don't apply myself, whatever that means. So yeah, for me, entrepreneurship, the journey started very young.
I love that you shared there that you can't apply yourself to something that you don't connect to, and how you had teachers that you really got you and connected with you and helped you, and then other things that you just really didn't care about. Because I've never heard anybody describe it exactly like that, and that's exactly how I was as a kid. I love learning, read all the time, and if I don't understand why or how it applies to my life or business or anything else, I could care less and I won't pay attention to it. And so in school, I didn't even finish high school really fully until a couple of years after I should have. And I barely got that figured out because I just couldn't connect on it. It made no sense.
Yeah, no, I hear you, man. I was very much the same way, but now that I look back on, so I used to think I was a really bad student. The story that I had growing up was that I was not a good student, because that was reflected back to me over and over and over again. You have challenges being a student. And, now as an adult and having done over 20 years of trauma work and personal work and therapy and, some psychedelic therapies, and really understanding myself better, I now look back and I know it wasn't that I was not a good student in the definition of student I existed in, but I was also the kid that was not paying attention to second century geography or whatever somebody was talking about. And I was reading in the back of the room. Most of the time when I wasn't on task, it was because I was absorbing or learning or trying to figure something else out. And so now I've reframed that. I'm an incredible student of life. I have a very hard time if I don't relate to the teacher.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. I think it's I think it's just super interesting how it takes us a long time to figure out that we were okay as a kid, but there was a lot of people telling us that we weren't okay.
You know, Gabe, here's how I always share it. It's like, for me, I work with wildly successful entrepreneurs. You know, we coach over 200 companies in our business right now. But just to give you an idea, we just had 4 or 5 of our members hit the Inc. 500 list. We had 4 of our members hit their first $1 million month in the past couple months in the middle of a virus crisis. We had one of our members hit his first $2 million month, which we're super stoked about. We started with him a couple years ago when I think he was about 4 or 5 million. Now he's at over $25 million run rate. And, you know, that like working with successful entrepreneurs has given me this view of who we are. And what I normally share with people is, you know, we spend our entire childhood being told everything that we shouldn't be. And then we spend our entire adulthood fighting back everything that we were told so that we can reveal who we really are, you know? And I think that happens to so many of us. And so many of us also hear these labels growing up. You know, I was lucky. I grew up in the 70s. So labels like ADD, ADHD, you know, bipolar, depressed, manic, like those weren't that popular back then, but hyperactive was a popular label. And I was labeled as hyperactive. I was also labeled as, a social, God, I can't remember the exact term, but it was like socially disobedient or some crap. You know, now they have much more involved labels for it. But you know, when I'm teaching one of our events, like when I'm in one of our summits with 200-300 entrepreneurs from around the world, because a lot of the companies we coach have 2 people, some have 3 people involved. I'll ask, you know, hey guys, let's just all be really honest with each other, because I think if we talk about this, it'll make it easier for everybody. How many of you have been diagnosed with some type of a mental issue? Like, let's just get really clear. And I want you all to know, I've been diagnosed with ADD, ADHD, Asperger's, and autism. So if you don't have 4 aces, you can't beat me. So like, let's figure out who's who, right? And that's just the beginning. And Gabe, every time, every hand in the room goes up, because entrepreneurs are different. And a lot of the psychological disorders that are described are just describing people who are unique and different and incredible. You know, we have this new disorder called like antisocial behavior and obsessive compulsive disorder and all these other things. And we label it all anti-bad, horrible, whatever, right? Dude, 10,000 tries to make a light bulb. Thomas Edison isolated himself, shut everybody out, and turned night into day. Jesus, you know what would happen today? He'd probably be like picked up by cops and put on Wellbutrin for being so isolated. And we would all be sitting here in the dark. And so, you know, I share that openly because I want people who are like me to shed all of those labels and understand that in the world today, people who stand out in any way try to get normalized right back to everybody else. And the reality is if you've had one of those labels, if you've been judged that way, if somebody has told you have a disorder, a disability, or an issue or a challenge, it probably just means you're extraordinary. And that's what we need to bring out. You know, society has this equation. If somebody doesn't look like everyone else, talk like everyone else, show up like everyone else, that is a broken human being. We need to diagnose, medicate, and get back to the crowd and make them just like us. And history shows without a doubt that the person who didn't show up like everyone else, Helen Keller, talk like everyone else, act like everyone else, and learn like everyone else is exactly the brilliant person who's going to change the world. And that like, I can start ticking off examples. Edison didn't pass algebra, you know, Einstein didn't pass algebra. I remember I was failing algebra when I found out that Einstein didn't pass algebra or speak until he was 2 years old. You know, look at Harriet Tubman. I mean, it's not Harriet Tubman's another incredible story, but what I meant was, look at Helen Keller. You know, Helen Keller, in the time that she was born, children who had her afflictions were often left for dead. Like, let's get real about what happened. And she came through it, overcame it, and went on to change the world. So, you know, I want us to discuss a lot, or I want us to understand a lot more that what makes us different is what makes us extraordinary.
Yeah, I love that you share that and that you're so open about that, because I remember when you were talking, maybe you had 2 talks, I forget, but part of it you were talking about, you know, the entrepreneurial personality type, and that was one of the first moments where I accepted myself. Like, It was one of the first times where I was like, oh, I'm not all screwed up. I'm meant to be this way. And I remember calling my girlfriend and saying, like, you know, you got to listen to this. And I sent her the recording. That's what I'm like, this is me. I finally figured out it's me and it's okay. And like, I just loved how open you were about that and, you know, showed up that way. And so it's so, I love what you're sharing, because it's so important to realize that it is extraordinary. You do have these amazing skills, and that you're never going to fit into normal because you weren't designed to be that way. And I also tell people, like, if you're around an entrepreneur and you get to serve and support them and like help them fit into the parts of normal life that maybe they have to, be around, then you are so important too. Because imagine the world full of entrepreneurs. It would be chaos.
Yeah. Can you imagine just entrepreneurs with no buffer? It'd be like a international cage match, like we do not want that.
So I'm so grateful, like, one that people like you are so open about where you're at and like what it's taken to get there and just understanding that. And I'm just amazingly grateful for people like that on my team. And like, I just love that we can, interact that way and be accepting and more loving of, everybody is obviously the goal.
Gabe, I want to share, like, it wasn't always that way. I just want everyone to know, like, I didn't come out this way. This is a lot of personal work and a lot of in-depth understanding and years of working with entrepreneurs. I'll share a quick story.
Yeah.
When I was 26, prior to 26, I had gone to talk therapists a couple of times, and it did not work out. When I was sitting on a couch, for me, this is for me personally and for a lot of my clients, sitting on a couch, spilling your guts, talking about everything that makes you uncomfortable and having somebody reflect back to you, how does that make you feel? What do you think we should do? I mean, it made me feel like I wanted to jump across the room and hurt that person. Like, I was just about to say not for real, but yeah, for real. It's not that I was going to do it, but it really, like, it enraged me going to talk therapy. Well, when I was 26, I went to EMDR therapy for the first time. And it's something I openly recommend to my clients. Most of my members are doing EMDR or some other type of therapy, but a lot of them are doing EMDR. And Gabe, I used to park like 2 buildings away and sneak over to the EMDR office because I was afraid anybody would see my car and think that I was a therapist. I was a consultant. I ran a huge business at the time. Like, part of the reason I was going was a breakup with a woman that I had been engaged to. Part of the reason that I was going was because I was completely overwhelmed in my business. And I was this, consultant with a huge team, and I had the answers, and that's how I saw myself. Like, I had to have all the answers. I had to be right. I couldn't let them see me sweat. I couldn't admit vulnerability. Yeah. And so when I look back at that human being now, I know exactly why I struggled so much. I had the job of running my business, but I also had the job of manufacturing the person that I was, and it was exhausting. That was harder than anything I did every single day, was trying to figure out how to continue to show up as this image I had created. Yeah. And when I finally got to the place where it took years, like, I want everyone to understand this doesn't just happen overnight. But when I was about 30, 31 or 32, I think it was closer to 32, a friend of mine who I worked with confided in me that he had been suicidal or was suicidal. And we were driving in South Florida, and I explained to him, I had been doing EMDR. And I remember in the moment of sharing it with him, I felt this like vulnerability and this voice in my head saying, like, do not do this, do not do this, do not tell him. And I did it anyway. And he came back a couple weeks later, and he's like, hey, I found a therapist. I started talking to him, and what you recommended really worked. But what you told me was even more important. You should tell more people about this. Yeah. And I didn't overnight start doing that, but that was one of the first times. Like, I had been in therapy 6 years and hadn't told anybody that I worked with. When I finally opened up to somebody, I got this massive positive feedback, and that opened the door to saying, like, hey, maybe I should share what's really going on. Maybe I should share what's really happening. And that's how I'm at the place now where I really, whenever I get on a podcast, some people, you didn't ask this, Gabe, but some people ask, so what topics are off limits? And I'm always like, none. Like, I don't care. Ask me whatever you want, And then I always immediately ask, what do people say is off limits? Like, maybe I should have some off limit stuff, but for me, it's radical transparency and being exactly who you are every day lowers the pressure and noise everywhere else in your life, and it radically lowers the pressure and noise in your business because. I think it's Chris Rock that has the joke, like, when you go to a party, you don't meet someone, you meet their representative, but it's the person acting like their representative. If you have that representative running your company, you are in for a lot of pain and a lot of challenges and a lot of employee turnover and a lot of collateral damage. The faster that you can be exactly who you are and let everyone know what's going on and just be transparent and real, the easier everything gets.
I thank you so much for sharing that, because it's definitely something that I've watched you do really well recently. And I know even just a couple of days ago, you posted about how Shawn Stevenson had challenged you to be even more vulnerable on stage and do more of that. And I mean, I'll be honest, like that's scary because like I think I do that some of the time, but I'm not really sure what it would look like to always be that vulnerable. And it's been really valuable to me, and I'm grateful even what you've been going through like in the last few weeks with some of your stuff being stolen and just all that. It's been super cool to see you show up and honestly express how you feel. And yet what you didn't do, and this is one of the reason I just respect you and appreciate what you're doing, is you didn't do it in like a really slimy, nasty way. Like it's a real problem that need to be addressed, and horrifically bad stuff happens in our industries. Right. And it's like, but you addressed it, but it wasn't in a way that I'd feel weird about being associated with you, if that's the simple way of saying it. And I'm just wondering how, and I know you said it took a lot of time. So obviously I'll continue to put the time in because that's part of the process here, but I'm just curious, what does that unlock for you? And like you said, nothing's off limits to you in a conversation like this, which I super appreciate, but what does it unlock for you, and how far do you go, or what point do you have to get to be able to just be yourself? Do you speak your mind all the time? I'm really curious about how you operate in the day-to-day in your business, because I know that you're totally right. As entrepreneurs, it's super tempting to build up this self-image and this outward perception of like, I'm tough, I got it all, and I never have any issues. And I don't think I'm going that way, but to be honest, I don't think that me or a lot of entrepreneurs, I'm sure that you first meet and interact with, are able just to flip the switch and be totally vulnerable. So I don't even know what it looks like, is I guess what I'm asking. I don't know if that's a good enough question or not.
I think the first answer that I gave is, it is a constant and never ending pursuit for me. It's not like I feel like I've arrived, and I actually sometimes find myself falling into old habits. I'll be at an event where the 5 guys standing around me have a bigger business than I do, and I'm like feeling inferior, and they'll ask me like, how big's your business? And I'll like choke on what to say because I don't want to be small, And then in those moments, like when I feel the discomfort rising, I have to ask myself, where is this coming from? This is coming from my own self-judgment. This is coming from my own impression of what I'm going to show up or look like or be. And it's funny. It takes a tremendous amount of faith, but the more vulnerable you are, the more magnetic you become to anybody who you want to help. It's crazy. I never thought that was real until I remember I was in an event years ago, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to share the entrepreneurial personality type totally different today. I'm not going to share all the academic research I've done. I'm not going to share all the conclusions I've gone to. I'm not going to share all the like stuff that is the calculation and the equation on the sheet. I'm just going to tell it from my own personal story. And I shared, like my life and how I figured this out, and where the obsessive reading came from, and the obsessive research and chasing down stories about people and why it worked and how it all came together. And gosh, I'm kind of getting goosebumps even talking about this. And it was one of the first times that I stood behind the stage, and I had just reread the book, The War of Art, not The Art of War, but The War of Art, Stephen Pressfield. Yep. And there's a page in there where Pressfield says, invoke the muse and call in your guides and like all this crazy spiritual stuff. So I remember standing behind the stage and I'm like, if I'm going to do this, I need to call in my guides. Who the heck are my guides? I'm like, you know what? I trust every entrepreneur throughout history who's ever walked the face of the earth. I'm going to get a little emotional because it's like I remember saying it. I'm going to call in every entrepreneur throughout history who's ever felt different, and whoever wanted to make a change in the world and saw that in themselves to come and help me today, support me today, be with me today. And I remember standing backstage and feeling as close to a religious experience as I've ever had. I'm not a religious person. I've studied tons of religion. I've never been able to like acquire the faith, but that day something tremendous happened. And I went on stage and I shared from this personal place. I barely looked at the slides. I was just exactly who I am. And there was 5 or 6 times during that presentation where I'm like, oh shit, I shouldn't have said that. And I just kept going. And when I was done, I don't know how many minutes the standing ovation was, but I finished and I had this realization that like I hadn't really been checking in with the audience as much as I usually do. And I looked out and like a third to a half of them were crying and clapping, and it just went on and on and on. And I'm like, okay, maybe something that, maybe Shawn's onto something here. This might be why he gets called to speak a lot more than I get called to speak. And so that was a really like extraordinary day. And from that point forward, I attempt to do the same thing, but I want everyone to know, like, this is an imperfect journey. There's times where you are going to show up like that. There's times where you don't, and then you work on it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's a great, like, step-by-step of how you got there, at least in one case. And that's how I learn, is like watching other entrepreneurs do things the right way. And it just means a lot that you share that, and I super appreciate that, man.
Yeah, for sure, Gabe. Can I share a little bit about the tactics so this is so important. I've actually been thinking about this a lot actually today, and not in anticipation of this podcast. It's just been coming up for me a lot today, because in the past couple of weeks, I've had that question, like, how can I be more vulnerable? How can I show up as myself? How can I transcend from this place of protecting and hiding and creating a veneer to just being who I am?
Yeah.
And I know that this sounds like an odd, like, transition, but here's what I believe it is. It's process and structure and routine in your life. And here's why I say this. I think as entrepreneurs, the one place where we can really not do well is perspective. Like, we can get into a weird place with our own perspective, because here's who we are. Every entrepreneur is that small percentage of the population that gets up in the morning, travels into the future, creates a new reality, comes back to the present, and demands it becomes real. And that is not an easy journey, nor is it an easy way to live.
Yeah.
And when you create process, structure, and routine in your life, and I mean hardcore process, structure, and routine, that journey becomes easier, but so does your perspective. And so does it becomes much easier to just be who you are. Because when you have the stability of a routine, when you have the stability of structure, when you are more consistent because you're leaning into those things, gosh, it's funny, as entrepreneurs, we fight process, structure, and routine, but when we lean into them, we're more creative, we're more capable, we show up more as who we are. And for me, I know now at 47 that hardcore process, structure, and routine has allowed me to go on stage and be incredibly vulnerable, because I know I have an entire superstructure behind me that no matter what happens on that stage, I'm going to be okay.
Yeah.
And I think that that's an important point to bring up, because I don't think enough entrepreneurs talk about this. I don't think enough entrepreneurs talk about having a morning routine and making sure you're hydrated and eating the right foods and meditating and breathing and drinking a ton of water and sleeping the right amount. Like, all of that process, structure, routine allows me to show up like this.
That's awesome. And I love that you share that, because you're totally right. I think the more entrepreneurs that I've studied, and you're repeating the same thing, is like, they do the same things every day, and they eliminate all these choices, that they don't need to make. And they eat the same things and wear the same things and do all this stuff, because it creates that stability. And the way you just described it, like the hard work of going into the future and bringing it back and like making it happen and explaining to a bunch of people is incredibly mentally exhausting. It's what we love to do, but it's a huge challenge and it's a ton of work. And the less chaos in the other areas of your life, absolutely, you're 100% right.
Well, and the more you can lower the reactivity that you're expressing and feeling.
Yeah.
And man, this is a big one for me. And really just in the past several years, I've had moments of reactivity that have actually challenged me legally. Like, I've gone out and said things in a rage and frustration where I've gotten lawyers' letters, and I'm like, crap, I'm doing it again. I've had outbreak, I've had like rages or times where I've gotten really upset, and it's affected my daughters. It's affected my family, and I look at those times and I'm like, how do I make it so that in that moment of choice, in that moment of feeling the adrenaline, of feeling the charge, that I'm still able to show up in a way that looks rational, that looks sincere, that looks like somebody you should follow and somebody you should listen to. And the only way I've been able to do that is by lowering the pressure and noise everywhere else in my life. That means I have a morning routine that every single day I get through that morning routine. That means that I'm following the same planning system on a daily basis. So I have perspective as to what I'm getting done and how much I'm getting done. I use our momentum planner, and every day I ask myself the question, where was I uncomfortable yesterday? so that I can make sure I get rid of those things in the day, or at least I acknowledge them so that they don't come up anymore. That type of process, structure, and routine is where entrepreneurial freedom really comes from.
Yeah, I love it. I 100% agree. And yeah, it's not what you think it is when you start entrepreneurship, but when you get into it and actually have to live it, then that's exactly what sets you free. And I think it's hard for people to realize that they can have that creative outlet and do more of it, like you said, if they have the structure. And it's counter to how I think we naturally feel sometimes as entrepreneurs, as the creative, as the visionaries. But you're totally right. It makes everything so much easier. So that's excellent advice.
Yeah, thanks, Gabe.
And I'm curious too, because when I first saw you present the Billionaire Code, like all the way from, entrepreneur at the top, seeker at the bottom, the whole thing, that super resonated with me and helped me like figure out where I was. And that's obviously a hard thing for entrepreneurs, is because we're out there being visionaries, trying to solve the world's problems, trying to make an impact. We don't really know where we fit. So that was such a great progression that gave me perspective. And so that was valuable to me. I'm curious if that was something that you kind of uncovered piece by piece as you went, or if it was more like longer batches of like deep reflective thinking of like, oh, that's what I did for the first 10 years and here's where I landed here. I'm just curious how that came to you and like what process of thought you use there, because I'm always really curious, like what thought work we need to do to elevate to the next level and make a bigger impact. So hopefully that makes sense as a question.
It does. It makes sense. And I'll share like how the Billionaire Code came about. So when I was younger, one of the first things I tried to learn on my own was personal development. And I was introduced to Tony Robbins, Bandler and Grindler, the original NLP guys. I didn't really listen to them. I didn't relate. Wayne Dyer, I related to like crazy. And so that was kind of my entry. And then I started leaning into personal development. And here was the issue. You read 3 personal development books, one of them is going to conflict with the other 2. You read 5, the 5th one's telling you the first one's invalid, the second one's telling you the 3rd one's all wrong, and the 4th one is definitively telling you everything else is wrong. This is the only thing you should do. You get up to 10, there's even more clumps, like 20, it's even worse. Yeah. And as a kid, I couldn't take that conflict. And I know now it was because I didn't have the experience to be able to like litmus test what I was reading, but it was just frustrating and it caused anxiety. And so I shifted and I just started reading about successful people. I became kind of obsessive about reading about successful people. I think some kids like obsess over bugs, some kids obsess over cars, like some kids obsess, like they start categorizing and putting things. For me, it was successful people and like business, like who was successful and who was creating a big business. And if you read the lives of successful people, they look radically different if you only read a few. Yeah. But when you start reading like 100, 200, 500, you get into the thousands of like reading biographies, reading times in people's lives, you start to see these patterns. And the first pattern I saw was these foundational questions that entrepreneurs ask as they grow through their lives. And so in the Entrepreneurial Personality Type book, the last chapter, what is called an EPT's Fundamental Life of Questions. And it's the questions we ask. It's how do I stop pressure and noise? What's wrong with me? How do I get ahead? How do I get further ahead? How does my team get me ahead? How do I get my team ahead? How do I get my team further ahead? How do we help others? How do we help everyone? And those 9 questions were so clear. Like, God, Gabe, I remember reading like obsessively about Bill Gates. Gates is like such a unique character, Early in life, he was public enemy number 1. No joke. Gates was like the guy who was using the legal system as a battering ram against the United States. Like Bill Gates sat in front of Congress, gave one-word answers when he was being sued by like half the states in the country, the federal government, and 7 or 8 different countries internationally, and just sat there like, bring it. That was his how do I get further ahead period, like the angry, crushing, like I'm going to hurt everybody period. And when you look at that, you can see these clear patterns of how entrepreneurs think and how they behave and how they show up. And so that was first. And here's what happened. I kept obsessing over these questions. And I remember one day I drew them out this way. And then I started saying, I wonder like what stage of business you would be in with this question and how does it work and how does it all go together? And then I started like linking it up. And I had always had this obsession, like, is there one true path to entrepreneurial success? And I had actually asked tons of coaches that, and everyone was like, Alex, no way, man. There's no clear path. There's no way you can spell it out. Every business is different. People go through it in a different way. And I would get examples of how I was wrong. And then there was this day where I was like obsessing over the billionaire code. I went and I was going to share the entrepreneurial life of questions and what I had figured out at Genius Network. And Clayton Mask, who runs Infusionsoft, was right after me speaking. And we had almost identical ideas. Like his was different from ours, like research they had done in Infusionsoft. And I was doing research in the world. And it was like confirmed, whoa, there really is a way that you can do this. And then I went back and completed the billionaire code and started sharing it. And Gabe, it was so intense. When I first went out and said, I think I've found the true path to entrepreneurial success. If you want to go from 0 to 100 million, this is really what it takes. These are the transitions. This is exactly where you should focus. And I shared it with this huge room of people. And I'm expecting like at the end questions like, what about this? What about that? What about this? And again, it was like a huge standing ovation, people crying. And I'm like, whoa. They're crying over a framework. How did that happen? And I remember talking to people afterwards and they're like, you have no idea. Like you just cleared up so much of why I've been stuck. Or, you know, as soon as you got to the 3rd level, I realized my income's at the 5th level, but I haven't done that yet. And that's why we're struggling so much. And so ever since I started sharing the entrepreneurial personality type and the billionaire code to entrepreneurial audiences, it's just been accepted as truth. And that has been the most humbling and the most validating thing that's ever happened to me. To be able to go through the experience and the pain and the challenges that it took to create this material, and then to be able to take it out to people who are just like me, like part of my tribe, people who whenever somebody says like the entrepreneurial personality type, like explain to me like what you just said, Gabe, here's what I hear. I just hear validation for me.
Yeah.
Like, man, I am not alone. You know, I am not alone and there is nothing wrong with me. It's what's literally on the back of our book. It says, there's nothing wrong with you and you are not alone. Yeah. And so, yeah, I appreciate you sharing that earlier. It means a tremendous amount to me.
Yeah, it was such a moment of empowerment and self-acceptance. And like, when we accept ourselves, I think everything gets a lot easier, like we've been talking about. And so it was such a good moment. It was such a turning point. And then I think Shawn was before or after you in the conference, and then he talked, and I will never forget both just the impact you guys made in my life, because I finally opened up and like let go of a piece of that facade, you know, a piece of what I thought I was supposed to be. And it's been such a better journey since then.
Yeah. No, it's a game changer.
Yeah. It's amazing.
And
so
it was, you know, it's hard to be friends with a guy like Shawn Stevenson and not show up as who you are, you know?
Yeah.
And you had mentioned earlier that like about a Facebook post that I shared. Shawn and I were friends for a long time. We met, I think, in 2013 at a Genius Network meeting. And from that moment, we were friends. And I always tease Shawn that he hung out with me because I made him feel less awkward. And so for people who don't know Shawn, he was about 2.5 feet tall. He suffered from a disease called osteogenesis imperfecta, which made it so that his head was much larger in proportion to his body. His lower body didn't really work. And as a kid, his bones were brittle and they would break all the time. And so they were kind of twisted and not really like where everything should be. But Shawn had this ability to inspire people and to be able to talk to people, and he wanted to cure the world of their feelings of vulnerability. And I remember he would say that, and I would think, man, if there's anybody who can do it, it's going to be Shawn. Yeah. And there was this morning where Shawn and I had been talking about like being more vulnerable, being more real. And I did a Facebook Live, and I got a text message right after the Facebook Live that he was like, hey, let's talk or something. And I can't remember if he put it in writing or if I jumped on the call with him, but either way, the first thing he said was, that wasn't very good. You know? And he's like, and I think he said it like Shawn would say it, like, I love you, man. That was not very good. And he's like, and he kind of lit me up. He's like, Alex, enough of this. Like, you need to share more of yourself. You need to share who you are. You need to tell people what's really going on. Stop writing everything down and taking notes. Just channel it and let it come out. We need more of you. We need you to be who you really are. And I remember like thinking, okay, like when Shawn Stevenson tells you that that's what he does, and you can clearly see it demonstrated in every speech he's given, and like people around the world, you know, look up to this guy who is the shortest person in the room, but he's got the biggest strength and the biggest energy of anybody you've ever met. Maybe this is a path to that level of vulnerability. And I remember a couple days later, I did a Facebook Live about accepting people for everything that they are. You know, something that I pride myself on is that if somebody is different or unique, I want to understand those differences. I want to understand how they're unique. I want to make sure that I'm never judging those things. So when somebody shows up as, you know, transgender or it has different types of relationships or a different race than I am or a different religion than I am or a different viewpoint, I want to understand those things, but I also want to accept them and understand who they are. And in that next Facebook Live, I was really vulnerable and I ended up crying and getting emotional, which was something I don't normally do in public. And the amount of messages and support I got was so overwhelming that I'm like, dang it, Shawn's like, seriously, that guy knows a lot about life. And so since then, I've tried to model that as much as I can.
Yeah. Yeah. He just demonstrates it, and it's just how he communicated is just, I don't know, it's next level. And I totally understand how that impacted me. That's so awesome. And it's awesome to see an entrepreneur like that whose impact goes on and on and on. And that's definitely where I want to be too, is long-term impact. And so that's something that I just appreciate about you. And I'm really grateful that you lead the way, because it's easier for a guy like me who's about 10 years younger than you to see, oh, here's how it can be done and here's the path forward. That means a ton to me. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Gabe. That means a lot to me too. I mean, my life is like about helping entrepreneurs do what they want. So every time I hear something like that, it's like, okay, I'm going the right direction.
That's awesome. So talk to us a little bit about, you have this Momentum Masterclass coming up. What's that about, and who should show up for that?
Well, Gabe, I think right now is one of the most challenging times in the history of the world, maybe the most challenging, but I also think it is the biggest opportunity I've ever been a part of. Like we are, like I said earlier, we have members that are just exploding in the middle of this. And when there is this much transition in the world and this much pain in the world, there is massive opportunities for entrepreneurs to show up, to help, to bring in solutions, to be able to change this. And here's what I believe about the crisis we're in. And I believe this at a religious level. That's how strongly I believe this, is that what will happen in this crisis is exactly what's happened in every crisis before us. Entrepreneurs like you and I will rise above the noise, grab onto an opportunity, get it into momentum, and take the world with us and solve this thing. Like, governments have never solved a problem ever. Let's get real. You know, let's not leave it in their hands. Let's snatch it away from them and go fix this sucker. And I know that there's a lot of entrepreneurs who have been knocked sideways and they're struggling. There's also a lot of entrepreneurs who have more opportunity than they've ever been able to handle, and they don't know how to address it all. Yeah. And so October 6th, 7th, and 8th, I'm doing 3 days of live training, no charge. And it's all about getting into and understanding momentum and staying there. So the first day, we're going through the entrepreneurial personality type, understand who you are, and the billionaire code, know exactly where you are in business. The next day, we're going to look at how you create momentum, not how I do it, how you do it, so you can repeat it over and over again. We're going to help you build a plan to walk yourself into the place where you want to, so you know exactly where you're going. And then we're going to close it down with understanding how to consistently know exactly what to do next, so that you have clarity, confidence, and commitment, and you stay in momentum. So at the end of the 3 days, you will, if you're not in momentum to start, you will be there at the end. But more importantly, you'll know how to tap into it, access it, and do it over and over again. Because here's what I believe about entrepreneurs. When somebody says, like, you can get into flow for a few minutes, or, you know, I had this great half hour and stuff, I don't buy it. Here's what I think. I think we were meant to live in momentum. It's when we feel alive. It's when we feel engaged. It's when we feel like we're actually doing what we're supposed to do and showing up as what we were supposed to be. And so I want to show people how to get into and stay in momentum permanently, because that is absolutely an option, and don't let anybody tell you different. And anyone who wants to hang out with us and do this, you can go to momentummasterclass.com. You'll be sent some links to a manual, some links to some other stuff eventually. And this is going to be an incredible 3 days with entrepreneurs from around the world, and we're going to change some lives.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Alex. We'll share that with everybody. Definitely encourage you guys to sign up and be a part of that. What you're talking about there of like permanent momentum is super, super attractive. So I will be there and be a part of that. And that's just, I love that you're sharing all that. And again, thank you so much for all the time. We'll definitely have you back in the future. And I just really appreciate the leadership and just how you show up. It means a lot to me, and I know to the rest of the entrepreneurial community. So thank you.
Yeah, Gabe, and I appreciate you as an interviewer, sharing of yourself vulnerably and being real with me, because it makes it so much easier. And this was actually a tremendous amount of fun, and I'm looking forward to the next time, man.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to Today's Business Leaders with Gabe Arnold. Remember to subscribe on iTunes. For more information, visit todaysbusinessleaders.com.